Part 1. The Big Hook, the Holy Greed. Look closely at the image of the two warriors before you. On the left side, you see a pious, heavily armored crusader. He is kneeling respectfully in silent prayer, holding his sword like a cross, bathed in a divine ray of heavenly light. He looks like the ultimate, flawless symbol of righteousness and faith. But on the right side, you see the exact same crusader. Only this time, his face is splattered with blood, his eyes are wide with madness, and he is violently looting gold coins and sacred chalices from a burning Christian church. This dramatic, horrifying contrast represents the ultimate hidden truth of the Middle Ages. For centuries, the Crusades have been highly romanticized in movies, literature, and popular culture as the ultimate holy mission. We are constantly taught that these brave European knights were driven entirely by religious devotion, leaving their homes to peacefully liberate the Holy Land and protect the innocent. We picture them as shining heroes fighting a noble war for God. But what if the history books you studied in school left out the darkest and most disturbing chapters? Behind the righteous sermons and the shining armor lies a 200-year saga of unbelievable chaos, political manipulation, and absolute holy greed. While genuine faith may have sparked the initial fire, the overwhelming promise of unimaginable wealth, land, and unchecked power quickly took over the minds of the men who marched east. In this documentary, we are going to completely tear away the romantic myths of the Crusades. You will witness exactly how a sacred holy war rapidly devolved into a brutal, unorganized campaign of massive plunder. We will explore the horrific massacres that took place right in the heart of Europe before the armies even reached the desert. And most importantly, you will discover the ultimate betrayal. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 remains one of the enduring and most tragic memories of the Crusades, revealing exactly how a holy mission was completely consumed by greed. You will discover how the army of God ended up violently attacking, looting, and destroying the greatest Christian city in the entire world. Part 2. The Call and the Cost, the Heavy Price of Faith. To understand how this era of holy bloodshed began, we must go back to the freezing winter of 1095. At the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II delivered a fiery speech that completely changed the course of human history. He spoke of atrocities committed against Christians in Jerusalem and appealed to a sense of honor, urging the Franks to stop fighting each other and instead unite to wage war in the East. The response across Europe was explosive, as tens of thousands of people sewed crosses onto their clothes and prepared for a holy war. But who exactly were the men that answered this historic call? For a very long time, old-fashioned historians argued that the Crusaders' main motive was greed for money and booty, driven by the laws of primogeniture, where Europe was flooded by younger sons of the nobility who had no land to inherit. The story went that these younger, landless brothers went to the Middle East simply to steal territory and get rich quick. But modern historical records reveal a vastly different and much more complicated reality. In actual fact, many of the Crusaders were wealthy firstborn sons. Participating in a medieval crusade was an astronomically expensive undertaking, as a typical crusader needed to raise at least 4 or even 5 times his annual income just to equip himself and set forth. To fund a military journey across thousands of miles of treacherous terrain, these elite nobles had to sell their massive estates, drain their family treasuries, and knowingly bankrupt themselves by heavily mortgaging their ancestral lands. They were initially driven by a profound, genuine religious zeal, absolutely desperate to secure the salvation of their souls. However, extreme piety and extreme greed are not always mutually exclusive. In the brutal reality of medieval warfare, the taking of booty and plunder was considered an essential and completely legitimate right of the victor. As these massive European forces began to march eastward, the crushing financial pressure of their journey began to severely twist their holy mission. They had literally bankrupted their families to get there, and they were utterly desperate to recover their lost wealth by any means necessary. This toxic mixture of religious fanaticism, military power, and financial desperation created a highly volatile powder keg. And it did not take long for that powder keg to explode in the most horrific way imaginable. The very first victims of this holy crusade were not the opposing armies in the distant deserts of the Middle East. Instead, the violence turned inward. Before the Crusaders had even left the continent of Europe, violent mobs turned towards the Jewish communities in the Rhineland in 1096, giving them the brutal option of converting to Christianity or being slaughtered. Thousands lost their lives in a wave of unspeakable terror, marking the bloody beginning of 200 years of pure chaos. Part 3. The Slaughter of Jerusalem. After years of unimaginable suffering, starvation, and grueling warfare, the surviving Crusaders finally reached their ultimate destination in the blistering heat of June 1099. The holy city of Jerusalem stood before them, heavily fortified and defended by the Fatimid garrison. For 5 agonizing weeks, the Christian army besieged the ancient stone walls. The environment was incredibly hostile. Water was dangerously scarce, and the surrounding landscape lacked the forests needed to build siege weapons. Driven by absolute desperation, the Crusaders actually dismantled their own ships and ruined buildings just to salvage enough wood to construct their siege towers and catapults. The Muslim defenders relentlessly hurled heavy stones, fired storms of arrows, and poured boiling oil down upon the exhausted European knights. But the Crusaders were driven by a religious fanaticism that bordered on absolute madness. On the night of July 14th, they secretly moved one of their massive wooden siege towers to a less fortified position at the northeast corner of the wall, taking the defenders completely by surprise. The following morning, under the command of Godfrey of Bouillon, the Crusaders pushed the tower forward, dropped the drawbridge onto the ramparts, and poured into the sacred city. What followed next was not a glorious holy liberation. It was one of the most horrifying and indiscriminate massacres of the medieval era. Once inside the gates, the exhausted and traumatized Crusaders completely lost their humanity. They systematically slaughtered almost every single person they encountered, making absolutely no distinction between armed soldiers and innocent civilians. Entire neighborhoods were rapidly transformed into gruesome killing grounds. The violence was so absolute and so shocking that eyewitness chroniclers of the time struggled to describe the sheer volume of death. The crusader and chronicler Raymond of Aguilera famously wrote that inside the Temple of Solomon, the Christian knights literally rode in blood up to the knees and bridle reins of their horses. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were butchered in a frenzied orgy of violence, all supposedly committed in the name of God. The psychological contradiction of that day was staggering. While the streets outside ran deep with human blood, many crusaders dropped to their knees inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping and praying, fully convinced that their horrific actions had washed away their sins. The First Crusade had achieved its ultimate objective, successfully conquering Jerusalem and establishing a new Latin kingdom in the Middle East. But the sheer brutality of this victory permanently poisoned the region. It introduced a vicious cycle of violence, bred deep generational mistrust, and created a profound hostility that would continue to fuel endless wars for centuries to come. The holy mission had been fundamentally stained by innocent blood. But as the dust settled, a new, far more calculating motivation began to emerge from the carnage. Part 4. The Business of Holy War. With Jerusalem secured, the Crusaders did not just pack up their weapons and return to Europe. Instead, they carved up the conquered lands and established 4 distinct, permanent European colonies in the Middle East, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch. But maintaining these isolated crusader states required a massive, continuous flow of money, weapons, and fresh soldiers. This logistical nightmare sparked a profound transformation in the very nature of the Crusades. The Holy War slowly stopped being a purely religious pilgrimage and rapidly evolved into a highly lucrative international business. The brilliant and ruthless merchants of the Italian city-states, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, immediately recognized a golden economic opportunity. They provided the vital fleets of ships needed to transport the heavily armored knights across the Mediterranean Sea. But their help was never free. In exchange for their naval support, these merchant republics demanded extreme economic privileges. They secured highly profitable trading posts in the newly conquered coastal cities of the Levant. Suddenly, a massive, unprecedented pipeline of exotic wealth began flowing directly into Europe. The violent Crusader campaigns reopened ancient trade routes that had been broken for centuries, flooding Western markets with highly demanded luxury goods like fine silk, precious metals, and exotic spices. In fact, modern food historians trace the sudden explosion of spices in European cuisine directly to Crusaders returning home with a newfound taste for Syrian pepper, Egyptian cumin, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Even sugar, which was initially seen as a rare luxury, began to make its way into the European diet thanks to these Crusader connections. At the exact same time, a new financial empire was born to manage this flow of wealth. The Knights Templar, originally founded to protect pilgrims, invented a revolutionary system of international banking. Instead of carrying heavy bags of easily stolen gold across treacherous lands, a European pilgrim could deposit their cash at a Templar stronghold in London or Paris. In return, they received a highly encrypted letter of credit, which they could safely carry and exchange for local currency upon arriving in Jerusalem. Without realizing it, the Crusades had just birthed the modern banking system, complete with international checks and safe deposit boxes. This massive influx of Eastern wealth stimulated the dramatic growth of European towns, ultimately leading to the rise of a powerful and highly influential new merchant class. The Mediterranean Sea was transformed into a bustling, incredibly wealthy corridor of international commerce. But this explosive economic success carried a dark and dangerous consequence. As the generations passed, the original spiritual zeal of the First Crusade began to fade away, completely replaced by cold, calculating political ambition and commercial greed. The popes, kings, and merchants of Europe were no longer just fighting for the salvation of their souls. They were fighting to control the most valuable trade networks on the planet. And this insatiable hunger for wealth and power would eventually lead the Crusaders to commit the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. Part 5. The Deal with the Devil. By the turn of the 13th century, the original religious fervor of the Crusades had been heavily corrupted by politics, logistics, and raw economics. In the year 1202, Pope Innocent III called for a fourth crusade. This time, the strategic plan was different. Instead of marching across land, the ultimate goal was to recapture Jerusalem by striking at the powerful center of the Muslim world, Egypt. But to move a massive army across the Mediterranean Sea, the Crusaders needed a monumental fleet of ships. They turned to the Republic of Venice, the undisputed maritime and commercial superpower of the era. Here, the Crusaders struck a fateful deal with Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice. Dandolo was an extraordinary and terrifying figure. He was in his 90s and completely blind, yet he was one of the most ruthless, brilliant, and calculating political minds in European history. The Venetians agreed to build a massive, dedicated fleet to transport the invasion force. But this monumental engineering effort came with an astronomical price tag. The Crusaders were required to pay 85,000 silver marks, which was an unimaginable fortune at the time. When the Crusader army finally assembled in Venice, they faced a disastrous reality. The leaders had vastly overestimated their numbers. Only 12,000 men had arrived, and they were desperately short of the funds required to pay the Venetians. They pooled all their resources, but they could not meet the contracted price. They were completely trapped. They had no money, no ships, and no way to reach the Holy Land. Seeing an incredible opportunity, the blind Doge offered a chilling, Machiavellian compromise. He agreed to defer their massive debt if the Crusader army would help Venice attack and conquer the rival port city of Zara. There was just one massive, undeniable problem. Zara was a wealthy, independent Catholic city inhabited by fellow Christians, and its king had even pledged to join the crusade himself. Despite explicit, furious letters from Pope Innocent III forbidding the attack and threatening mass excommunication, the desperate crusaders accepted the Venetian deal. In November 1202, the army of God broke through the walls of Zara and violently sacked a Christian city simply to pay off a financial debt. The holy warriors had effectively transformed into corporate mercenaries, but their descent into greed was only just beginning. Part 6. The Ultimate Betrayal. After the shocking and brutal attack on Zara, the Fourth Crusade was diverted once again, spiraling further away from the Holy Land. An exiled Byzantine prince named Alexios IV Angelos approached the heavily indebted crusaders with a tantalizing, irresistible offer. If they helped him seize the throne of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, he promised to pay off all their Venetian debts, supply them with 10,000 soldiers, and fund their entire expedition to Egypt. Blinded by the promise of unimaginable wealth, the Crusaders agreed. They sailed their massive fleet to Constantinople. At the time, this was the largest, wealthiest, and most magnificent Christian city in the world, filled with ancient bronze statues, grand palaces, and legendary riches. The Crusaders successfully intimidated the city and placed Alexios on the throne. But the young emperor quickly realized a fatal flaw in his plan. The royal treasury was practically empty. Despite confiscating sacred icons and stripping dead emperors of their rich vestments, he could not pay the astronomical sum he had promised the Westerners. The Crusaders were absolutely furious. They were heavily armed, stranded outside the city walls, and still deeply in debt. The tension reached a boiling point, and the Crusader army turned their weapons entirely on their fellow Christians. In April 1204, they breached the massive walls of Constantinople. What followed was not a holy war. It was a horrifying 3-day orgy of unspeakable violence, destruction, and crude, unrestricted greed. The men who had sewn the cross onto their chests to protect Christendom violently sacked the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. They smashed ancient bronze statues in the Hippodrome, looted sacred relics from the churches, and stripped the gold and silver from the magnificent altars. When Pope Innocent III heard the news of this absolute atrocity, he was horrified. He wrote a furious, condemning letter to the Crusaders, stating, "It was not against the infidel, but against Christians that you drew your sword. You have broken your Christian vows and have despoiled the churches and their treasures. But the papal outrage could not undo the damage. The Fourth Crusade never even made it to the Holy Land. The capture and plunder of Constantinople dissipated their war efforts entirely, permanently crippling the Byzantine Empire and creating a bitter rift between Eastern and Western Christians that remains to this day. The religious facade had completely crumbled, exposing a brutal historical truth. The great crusading movement had been entirely consumed by the ruthless pursuit of wealth and power. Part 7. The Children's Crusade. As the decades of warfare dragged on, the chaotic and corrupted nature of the Crusades eventually infected the most vulnerable members of medieval society. In the summer of 1212, a highly unusual and deeply tragic popular movement swept across the European continent. led by charismatic figures like a young French shepherd named Stephen of Cloyes and a German youth named Nicholas of Cologne, who carried a T-shaped Tau cross. Thousands of people abandoned their homes and began a long, desperate march toward the Mediterranean Sea. According to traditional, highly romanticized legends, this was a crusade entirely made up of innocent little children. The story claimed that these pure-hearted toddlers firmly believed the sea would miraculously part for them, allowing them to walk dry-shod to Jerusalem and peacefully convert the Muslims using only the power of their faith. But modern historical scholarship reveals a much darker and far more depressing reality. 13th century writers describe the participants using the Latin term pueri. While this word literally translates to boys or children, it was also a common medieval term used to describe impoverished teenagers, landless peasants, young adults, and the desperate urban poor. This was not a miraculous march of toddlers. It was a massive, tragic migration of the starving, the hopeless, and the economically ruined classes of Europe. Without papal approval, without weapons, and without funding, their journey was doomed from the very start. When the exhausted survivors finally reached the coast of the Mediterranean, the sea did not part for them. Instead, the harsh reality of human greed took over. Two local merchants, identified in historical chronicles as Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, stepped forward and generously offered to provide 7 ships free of charge to carry the believers across the sea. Believing their prayers had been answered, thousands boarded the vessels. But it was a devastating trap. 2 of the ships sank in a violent storm near Sardinia, drowning everyone on board. The other 5 ships sailed directly to North Africa, where the merchants ruthlessly sold the surviving crusaders into brutal slavery. The holy fervor of the poorest Christians had been callously exploited for profit. The tragedy of this movement did not lie in its defeat by enemy armies, but in its absolute betrayal by the very people who should have protected them. Part 8. The Last Stand. Despite 200 years of endless bloodshed, fanaticism, and extreme financial sacrifice, the European grip on the Middle East was slowly and inevitably crumbling. By the year 1291, the Grand Crusader experiment came to a terrifying, definitive end. The wealthy, cosmopolitan port city of Acre stood as the very last major Christian stronghold in the Levant. In the spring of 1291, a massive and highly organized Mamluk army, led by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, arrived before its towering stone walls. The Christians had heavily fortified the city, but the reality inside the walls was deeply fractured. The defense was hampered by the fact that the major military orders, including the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights, were constantly squabbling and fighting among themselves. The siege that followed was apocalyptic. For over a month, the Mamluk artillery relentlessly pounded the defenses. Flaming projectiles rained down on the city, and sappers successfully undermined the foundations of the massive outer walls. When the enemy finally breached the heavily contested Accursed Tower and the King's Tower, brutal, hand-to-hand street combat erupted in the narrow corridors. The defense collapsed into sheer chaos as panicked civilians ran for the harbor, hoping to escape on merchant ships. During the ferocious fighting, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was struck by a deadly arrow. The projectile bypassed his shield and pierced his chainmail right under his armpit, dealing a fatal blow. As the bleeding commander stumbled away from the front lines, his panicked men, unaware of the severity of his wound, begged him to stay and hold the line. His legendary final words perfectly captured the ultimate, tragic death of the Crusader dream. He looked at his men and said, "I am not running away. I am dead. Here is the blow." With his death, the city of Acre completely collapsed. The surviving Christian soldiers and civilians were either slaughtered in the streets or captured and enslaved. After 2 centuries of holy war, the Crusader states were entirely wiped off the map. The movement had ended exactly as it began, in a terrifying storm of fire, ruin, and rivers of blood. Part 9. The True Winners of the Holy War. When the dust finally settled over the ruins of Acre in 1291, the grand crusading experiment had collapsed in absolute catastrophic failure. The European knights had permanently lost the Holy Land. Millions of lives had been extinguished, and countless noble families had been utterly bankrupted. But if the kings and the knights lost the Holy War, who actually won? To find the true victors of the Crusades, we must not look at the blood-soaked sands of the Middle East, but at the bustling, wealthy ports of Italy. The undeniable winners of this 200-year conflict were the ruthless, calculating merchants of Venice, Genoa, and Florence. Throughout the Crusades, these Italian city-states acted as the primary military contractors. They provided the massive fleets of ships required to transport the Crusader armies across the Mediterranean Sea, but they always demanded an astronomical price. By leveraging the desperation of the holy warriors, they secured highly profitable trading posts in every conquered coastal city, establishing a complete monopoly on Eastern commerce. This relentless pursuit of profit led to incredible economic shifts. The Crusades stimulated massive trade networks between Europe and the Islamic world, reintroducing exotic goods that had been lost to the West since the fall of the Roman Empire. European markets were suddenly flooded with highly demanded luxury items, such as imported sugar, fine silk, and rare spices like pepper and cinnamon. This massive influx of international trade generated unprecedented, unimaginable wealth. It directly caused the explosive growth of European market towns and facilitated the dramatic rise of a brand new, incredibly powerful merchant class. The wealth extracted from the chaos of the Crusades, including the priceless ancient relics, gold, and magnificent bronze statues violently looted during the sack of Constantinople, flowed directly into the vaults of these Italian merchants. And ironically, it was this exact blood-soaked wealth that would eventually fund the breathtaking art and explosive innovation of the European Renaissance. Part 10. The Legacy of Chaos. As we look back at the 2 centuries of the Crusades, the romanticized Hollywood image of the noble, righteous knight completely shatters. The history of the Crusades is not a simple story of good versus evil. It is a profound, chilling demonstration of how easily genuine religious devotion can be twisted, manipulated, and weaponized by those in power. What began in 1095 as a desperate, fervent pilgrimage to secure spiritual salvation rapidly devolved into an uncontrollable machine of political ambition, unimaginable violence, and holy greed. The legacy of these wars is permanently etched into the fabric of the modern world. The aggressive military campaigns ultimately failed to secure the Holy Land, but they permanently altered the global balance of power. The devastating betrayal and sack of Constantinople permanently crippled the Byzantine Empire and created a bitter, unhealable rift between Eastern and Western Christianity that still remains to this day. Furthermore, the relentless violence introduced a deep generational hostility, planting toxic seeds of mistrust that have echoed through the centuries. The Crusades show us the absolute darkest side of human nature. They prove that when absolute military power merges with unquestionable religious authority, it can be used to justify almost any atrocity. The men who took the cross left their homes seeking heaven, but in their pursuit of wealth and glory, they ended up creating hell on earth. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden truth behind the darkest eras of human history, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We will see you in the next chapter.